Hey, welcome back to the channel. This is David Clayson. In my last video, I looked over some statistics that the Assemblies of God put out to see how our minister numbers are doing, or the total number of ministers in some other areas there, and seeing how that affects or will affect the Assemblies of God, especially in rural areas or ministry in rural areas. And while I was doing that, I was looking at that 2020 year, that pandemic year, and I said in that video that I would make a video focusing more on that and how COVID had an effect on ministers there. And so here it is. This is that video. I was kind of hesitant to do it because I know people are tired of hearing about COVID stuff, but I said I would do the video, so here it is. And let's jump right into it. We're going to start out here with just total numbers. The Assemblies of God does a pretty good job of tracking its ministers there, who applies, how many apply, so forth and so on. And even more recently, like the genders, the heritage, and all that too, which is pretty interesting. But when we look at the total number here, I have from 2018, total number of ministers in the Assemblies of God was 38,199. 2019, it was just two less, 38,197. And then we see a big drop there from 2019 to 2020, where there are 484 less ministers in the Assemblies of God, with 37,713. And then 2021, there's even less ministers, 37,557. So total ministers in the Assemblies of God. So we definitely, the Assemblies of God here, they have these records going back to 1966. And just doing a quick scan through that, since 1966 up to 2018, there was always an increase. Even if it was just by one or two ministers, more ministers than there were the previous year, there was always an increase all the way up to 2018. And then 2018 and 2019, that was the first decrease that I saw, doing a quick scan. And I was just losing two ministers. COVID happens, and all of a sudden, 484 less ministers in the Assemblies of God. And then the following year, there's even less, by a little under 200 less than that. And which is interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about it here as we go into some other sections. But we see COVID had an effect. People left the ministry in COVID more than they do typically each year. Because this total number here, you have ministers leaving the ministry every year. But what happens if there's an increase, that just means that more are coming in than are leaving. And so let's take a look at that actually when it comes to terminations in the Assemblies of God for ministers and their licensing. Now, there's a few different ways that you can be terminated from the Assemblies of God. Each year, ministers have to renew their license with the Assemblies of God and they sign papers saying, I agree to continue doing these standards to meet the ministry standard of the Assemblies of God and some other things like that. So one of the ways that they can be terminated is if they don't do that each year. That's called being lapsed in their licensing. And then the report also gave the number of those that resigned, that died, deaths that were reported to the Assemblies of God, or that were dismissed. That'd be people who get in trouble. They do something and they get dismissed, or those that did not renew. And I think the difference between renewed and lapsed is that lapsed during a probation period, but not renewed is, okay, you're no longer a minister in the Assemblies of God at all. So looking here, going back to 2018 again, I'm just trying to do a 4-year span. 2018 terminations, total terminations were 2,046. In 2019, there was a little bit more, 2,075. In 2020, terminations, there was a jump of about 50 in number, which really, if you think 37 plus 1,000 ministers, that's not that big a number, not that bad a number, but it was 2,124 people terminated, and then 2021 it was less, 2019. And now COVID, the big thing was death, and I'm sure you're probably curious about that here. And so each of these years here, when you look at the deaths that were reported to the Assemblies of God, the biggest number came in 2021. There were 645 deaths reported. In 2020, there were 559 deaths reported. And in 2019 was 434 deaths. And 2018 was 459. And so to take death out of that number, out of the number of ministers that were terminated, doing the math there is just simple subtraction. So without deaths, we see that the biggest loss is actually in 2019, with 1,648 ministers, 41 ministers leaving the ministry. The next one is not even 2020, it's 2018. 1,587 ministers leaving the ministry. And then you have 2020 with 1,565 ministers leaving. And then 2021 is actually the year that has the least amount of ministers being terminated in the Assemblies of God, with 1,374, which is interesting. I'm kind of curious. I'm looking at the other areas here. Yeah, I'm kind of curious what happened in 2019 and 2018 to make them bigger numbers of termination than 2020 and 2021. Because when we look at these other numbers here, especially the total number of ministers, there are more deaths, so that could account for why we have a lack of numbers and in 2020 and 2021. But that's only, from 2018 2019, that's only 200 more deaths for 2020 and 2021 compared to those 2 years. But yeah, you look at those numbers, and just judging by the numbers after you take out deaths. Again, I didn't really do the math for years before 2018, and I should, because it'd be interesting to see what those numbers are. But just out of those 4 years there, 2020 was a pretty average year for terminations. People, dropping, losing, lapsing in their license with the Assemblies of God, which is interesting. Now, does that show that the people are just resilient or what? I don't know. Maybe Assemblies of God or just ministers are tough or something like that. And then another number here I want to look at quick, because I don't want to make this video too long, but are additions. People who have entered into the Assemblies of God, gotten licensed, certified, licensed or ordained in the Assemblies of God, gotten their credentials in the Assemblies of God. In 2018, the number was 3,302. 2019, 3,168. 2020 was much less. And we're going to talk about this here for a second, because I also have statistics for ministers under 40, but 2020 was 2,803. 2021 was 2,808. And so, typically those that are getting credentialed in the Assemblies of God haven't been credentialed before, so they tend to be younger. And so that number there, is showing us that people are not as many people are entering into the ministry, at least with the Assemblies of God. Can't speak for all of the Christian denominations there, but after COVID, not too many people are entering the ministry. And there's so many things. When we look at these numbers, we got to remember these are the results. We don't necessarily have the data on what caused these results, though. We know the biggest thing in 2020 was COVID, and we could see that was probably had a big effect on these numbers here. But overall, we don't have the exact reasoning or results for why we got these numbers here. We're just making assumptions here. But there is less numbers. And 2021, last year, there's less people applying to be credentialed to the Assemblies of God. And I want to transition that into U40, because again, like I said, those seeking credentials tend to be younger, because older ones tend to have their credentials already, and so they just keep renewing them. But looking at U40, or when I say U40, I mean ministers under 40. I'm going to go to 2018 here. So this is the number of ministers in the Assemblies of God that are under 40. 2018 was 7,719. 2019 is 7,542. 2020, this is pretty big, is 7,045. So that's from 2019 to 2020, almost 500 less ministers under 40. And again, you got that they're aging out. So people, 41 and above, they're no longer under 40. So that's part of that. But there's also ministers that are leaving and things like that too. But there's 500 less. That's a big jump when you look at the rest of the numbers there. And then in 2021, 6,785. So another almost 300 person drop in ministers under 40. So that's not, you can't account all that just for people aging out of that category. That means that the Assemblies of God, during COVID has lost a lot of young ministers that they were too stressed. They didn't like what happened at the church. All these things could be factors on why these numbers are so big these past couple years here. And for this report there, it goes back to just 2000. It doesn't go back to 1966 like some other areas there. But this report goes back to 2000. The peak when it came to ministers under 40 was back in 2000 with 8,450. And I think looking at it, there were only like 4 or 5 years that had over 8,000 ministers that were under 40 in the Assemblies of God. There's a spike in 2013, 2014, but that typical number is in that 7,000 range or upper 7,000. But 2021 is the first year since 2000 where that number is under 7,000. And so talking about that there, we did see a decrease in total numbers. We saw a decrease in numbers of ministers, people coming into the ministry, and the number of under 40 ministers. But then you have that category of terminations of people leaving the ministry that was still average. So what does that tell us? Well, we are, even though not as many are being terminated or not more than usual are being terminated, whether they resigned, leave, lapse, dismiss, not renewed, we're still not on trend like we have been in the Assemblies of God, increasing the number of ministers that we have. In fact, if we look at these numbers here, U40, those ministers under 40, it continues to decrease. That's going to affect the total number of ministers here. Give it, 5, 10, 15, 20 years there, and that number is going to decrease a lot. And because of that, you look at terminations. If there are less ministers to terminate, then those terminations numbers are going to go down as well. And so that, that can't always be the best qualifying factor there. But yeah, COVID, we see what those categories there, COVID, and that may be an explanation for the termination category there. Less ministers to be terminated, therefore the terminations went down. But yeah, COVID did have an effect on ministers. We see, especially for that young minister number, that at the very least, when it came to people under 40, because the number is less, that means that there's less people that are under 40 that are applying to go into the ministry in 2020 and 2021, and there's also younger ministers that have left the ministry in 2020 and 2021. More than typical, more than usual. And so, it did have an effect on ministers. And so far, again, we have to wait for the 2022 report, but so far that it's still trending down. It's still has not recovered. In fact, it's still going down, which is not a good thing. Again, I think there's more factors to that outside of COVID. You have, church just not being a big priority for like my generation and a little bit, couple years older as well, who are having kids, young kids, because their parents didn't make it a priority, then they're not going to church, meaning they're not sending their kids to church. And as that continues to happen, less people will go to church, and that means there'll be less ministers as well. So there's so many different factors here, but we do know in these 2 years, 2020 and 2021, that COVID did have an effect. We see that in the numbers. We see that in the results here for the Assemblies of God. So COVID hit everybody in some way, in some format. And the Assemblies of God, when it comes to ministers, that's how it hit us. Was people just leaving the ministry more than usual, and people not joining the ministry as much either. So, just a thought. I was just taking a look at that number there and bringing it out for you. And yeah, well, man, I don't know. It'd be okay. Anyways, I don't want to ramble on too much here, but those are the numbers there. You take what you would like to do with those. It's just informative, I think. It just interests me, and so I wanted to make a video on it. I'll leave the link in the description so that you can click through every one of those reports. You can go really far back in the Assemblies of God there. Check it out yourself and look at those numbers yourself. But with that said, I'm going to close this off here. Thanks for watching. We will catch you in the next video. See ya.